All right. This week we are talking about chapter 31, which goes through, we're getting into the 60s, talking about Kennedy, President Johnson, the Civil Rights Act, the Vietnam War. And so these are some major topics. This is a packed chapter that I want you to be able to read what you can. But one of the reasons for these videos is for chapters like this, where a lot of the material is there, but I feel like that it's important for me to focus the areas that I want you to spend time on to understand a little bit better. So with that, let's start off with Kennedy's New Frontier. Kennedy has this idea that he wants to, there's this new frontier, and he wants to give federal aid to education, health insurance to an aging population. He wants to expand civil rights. He's got an idea that he wants to create a Department of Urban Affairs, expand the space program, and he tries to do all of these things. However, not very much gets done due to not having a Democratic majority in Congress, and we see a lot of that today. This is something that's fairly common when presidents try to do certain things and they can't get some of these things passed due to not having majority control of the House or Senate. Okay, so just know that the New Frontier is this idea of a president really taking control and saying, well, we need to pass legislation that's going to help people, that's going to help the base. Really, a lot of we see this a lot, especially with education and health insurance, things like that. When you're trying to do this, these are big ideas that presidents usually try to throw out there. And Kennedy tried to get it done and couldn't. Okay, a couple other things. The Vietnam War, we get started there. Kennedy decides he's going to send advisors to Vietnam. They're advisors. They're not necessarily combat troops. They're advisors, supposed to be advising on what's going on in Vietnam. You have communist control of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. We're supposed to be helping them. And so his idea is that we're not going to send troops. Okay, that's the idea. So instead we send advisors, which act as troops. I think there's 16,000 advisors that go. One other thing before we get into the assassination is communist Cuba. We've got this idea of the Bay of Pigs, and you have 1,500 expat Cubans who decide that they want to free Cuba of Fidel Castro's control. And so the United States really couples with them and sends the military down to Cuba. They're waiting offshore as these 1,500 expat Cubans go in, and they get caught right off the bat. And so the United States backs away and is like, well, we better not go in there. And that's the Bay of Pigs. We have a huge problem there, and we don't help those 1,500 people that go in. In turn, what that does is it really lets Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union believe that he can put nuclear weapons in Cuba. And so they start building silos to missile silos, and the United States sees this, and Kennedy says that we're not going to go down that path. And so they have this standoff where we get the idea of brinkmanship, which is going to the brink without going overboard. I mean, you're really coming together and seeing who's going to back down first, which creates the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, ultimately, in the end, Kennedy sends down a blockade and blocks Soviet Union ships going into Cuba. It looks like there's going to be a standoff. and shortly after the Soviet ships turn and leave, and that's kind of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is this idea of the Soviet Union taking off and not continuing to put their missiles into Cuba. Okay, but it really is brinkmanship. It's taking it right to the brink, potentially the brink of war, and standing your ground. I'm not really certain that how great it is, but the idea of brinkmanship is definitely in this chapter, and I would take a look at that. We get Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas, in this chapter. It's a very small piece, actually, to be honest with you, that we talk about it. But Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in as president, and then he is reelected in '64. Lyndon B. Johnson, his idea is the Great Society. His big theory is the Great Society. He declares war on poverty. Welfare is expanded. Medicaid and Medicare is created. Okay, I've been talking to a lot of people recently who believe that Medicaid and Medicare were created under the New Deal. That's not really the case. That came out of the Great Society with LBJ. Okay, there's more grants for college students. Racial quotas for immigrants into the United States were abolished, and the big deal with all of these things, with the Great Society, is that in order to pay for them, we have to raise taxes. And so in order to with raising taxes, that doesn't make a lot of people happy, especially when you're raising taxes to help the poor, which some people believe we shouldn't be doing. And so that is I guess a fundamental problem with the Great Society that we see during this time. Okay, LBJ continues to push this. He really finds, although he's a Southern Democrat, he finds a way to pass legislation in the Civil Rights Act. Okay, which I'll get to in just a second. Another big chapter on civil rights. The 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s is a big era for civil rights. Just to run down a few things, you have 1961, the Freedom Riders attempt to integrate buses and trains and bus and train stations. 1963, the March on Washington, which is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. You have 1964, the Civil Rights Act. You have 1965, the Voting Rights Act. These are all leading. This is nonviolence that is leading in this direction, but a lot of African Americans are saying that it's not happening quick enough. And so then we get the Black Power movement in 1968, Black National Movement, Black Power, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. I think a lot of times people think that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were against one another. That's not really the case. You just have two ways of looking at it. You have MLK, who is really looking at it as nonviolence. We need to move forward. If you look at it from the standpoint that he was a preacher, that makes a lot of sense. Turn the other cheek, this idea. But he was for protest. Like I said in our last week's video, he's for protesting. He gets thrown in jail multiple times. I mean, these are things that he's not just saying. He's passionate about those things. And when Malcolm X comes about, he had spent time in prison. He was frustrated with what was going on, and really followed this idea of by any means necessary. We need to do whatever we can and fight fire with fire. We're going to see really in the next chapter Michael Stokely doing the exact same thing, Carmichael Stokely doing the exact same thing, which pushes this idea of saying, look, we are tired of sitting back and asking for presidents or legislators to do what we need. Instead, we're going to take control into our own hands, and that's the rise of the Black Panther Party. Hopefully you'll see all of these things. If I were to give you an overarching theme, there is turmoil going on, and a lot of it stems with these two presidents, Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, trying to help the poor and the impoverished, the minority communities, trying to help them, and getting shot down by Congress and the Senate. Being able to pass some legislation, but still you're right at the edge of African Americans believing that nothing is ever going to happen for them. Okay, some of these things, yes, we get laws passed, but it doesn't go quite far enough. And so hopefully you can see that as you read this week. I wouldn't say this chapter is disheartening by any means, but there's a lot of things in it that may be difficult, but there's also some good things too. And so I'd look for those things. Ultimately, Kennedy's New Frontier, Johnson's New Society, and the Civil Rights Acts through the 60s are major themes that I want you to take a look at this week. I hope you have a great week. If you have any questions, email me, give me a call, stop by my office. We'll talk to you later. Bye.